from Kansas State University, this is Agriculture Today. Eric Atkinson with you. Here's what's ahead from Iowa State University, Lee Schulz, with this week's cattle market commentary. Lee will share information that he's put together on how the volume of calves sold at feeder auctions affects the prices paid at those auctions. Also, K-State's Jaymelynn Farney and Megan Rolf will discuss the value of breeding soundness examinations and EPD information when selecting bulls for spring breeding, for genetic advancement as well as calf production success. Later, K-State's Charlie Barden and Cassie Wandersee talk about current issues in Kansas tree resource management, part of the latest Kansas Forest Service podcast. And Jeff Wickman awaits with this week's 4-H segment here on Agriculture Today.
A social distancing tip.
While the CDC urges you to avoid close contact, like hugging or shaking hands, there are other non-physical ways to say hello. Wave, wink, use sign language, salute, smile, give the peace sign, throw up an air high five, do jazz hands. Remember, stay a minimum of 6 feet or 2 arms length away from others, and stay home if you can. For more info, visit coronavirus.gov.
Let's all do our part, because we're all #alone together. Brought to you by the Ad Council.
Thanks for tuning in once again. This is Agriculture Today, our Monday edition. The cattle markets, well, all sorts of things churning there that have the interest of producers and market watchers, and we will talk about several of those today with our guest, Lee Schulz, livestock economist out of Iowa State University. Let's briefly, though, Lee, look back at the trade this past week. Well, it was hardly anything to get all enthused about.
Futures markets were down all week. Cash market, it's really been kind of lower all week. We started earlier in the week at the 110 to 111 range. By the end of the week, we were in the 108 to 109 on a live basis. So overall prices were $1 to $3 lower. Certainly, a lot of talk in the market. Cattle prices are reacting to corn prices. And I think that's really a big sentiment driving the market. But also, I think it's important to remember that, there's probably been some incentive to move cattle this week, given the weather situation here, and bringing in, a fresh group of cattle. And I think that's somewhat drive what those calf prices were this week.
Quickly on boxed beef last week, what was the trend when it was all said and done?
Well, it's kind of that counterintuitive a little bit. We've seen it at times. We have actually seen boxed beef prices higher, about $4 to $6 higher. That speaks to a little bit of at least maintaining demand. So there's a little bit of mismatch between wholesale prices and cattle prices. But I don't think there's too much to read into that situation. Cattle slaughter levels were down this week, especially as we look through Friday, and I think that had an implication for wholesale values.
Once more, though, the market shocker was what happened with feed grains in particular. Midweek, the USDA reports lent a lot of momentum toward soaring prices in some respects. How do you read the longer-term implications of what we're seeing now with, pushing $6 cash corn in some locations, and the grain sorghum is certainly pricey as well?
Well, I like to put it in a bit of a short-term and longer-term perspective. And so, first, from a short-term, it's certainly a pinch point because, we haven't allowed the market from a feeder cattle standpoint or a fed cattle standpoint react yet to these new era of corn prices. And so I think there, you're having producers that maybe paid a little bit more for feeder cattle than what the current cost of gain situation would dictate that they're worth. And equally, maybe we're not seeing the fed cattle prices at the levels dictated by those higher cost of gains. And so I think, that's certainly taking the top off on seasonally higher prices and profitability that we typically see as we enter the spring period. But longer run, we should expect those cattle prices to kind of absorb the higher cost of gains. And also it's important, a lot of this is still just expectations, right? We've realized some higher prices, obviously on the futures market and the cash market, but we haven't really realized it as far as a diet cost unless we've started to book some of those needs. And so, I think importantly is understanding that what has happened is maybe there just isn't as much margin for error. So I think, right now we're expecting higher feed prices, but there's equal scenario, or there is a scenario in place that could get us lower prices from here. Because not too long ago, that was the expectation, right? And so, I think what we need to remember is to remain some flexibility here. It's not a time to go out and book all your feed needs because you're expecting $6 or $7 for it, right? But it is an opportunity if you do see to lock in a little bit of certainty, maybe to do that and to maybe put a ceiling on those prices.
By the sound of it, it doesn't appear you're writing off the chance for some decent returns to feeding cattle if one manages this correctly.
Well, even though we've seen this increase in cost of gain, my models suggest higher profitability in 2021 than in 2020, or, less of a loss, depending on how you look at it. And so, yes, cost of gains are higher. I have them higher, about $17 per hundredweight higher, but also fed cattle prices are expected to be higher, even though we're seeing, maybe even a marginal increase in feeder cattle prices. So, I think you really got to look at that crush, right? That is the important thing. So yes, feed prices are higher, but it's not all else equal. And so, with higher fed cattle prices, that will support profitability too.
For the balance of our time, want to talk about feeder cattle auctions and some things that you included in an article you recently wrote up, Lee. One of the angles you looked at here, sales volumes at those local feeder auctions and how those relate to the price trends at said auctions. Explain what you were pursuing here, if you would.
Well, this is some follow-through from some research I did a couple of years back here on Iowa auction sales. And I thought it was real timely to kind of remind myself of this, given what we experienced in 2020. The question is, do larger sales volumes lead to higher prices at individual markets? And you could really talk both sides of that coin. From a demand perspective, maybe larger sales attract more buyers, and with that added competition, you get higher prices. But you could equally say, well, if you got large sales and you don't have that competition, that's going to bid down those prices too. Also, larger sales, are attractive to buyers because there's kind of a lower cost of operation, because it's easier for me to put together load lots of cattle that are pretty uniform. And so I can afford to pay maybe a higher price than if I have to go to multiple auctions to do a similar endeavor. So, a lot of the research is mixed out of us that have done analysis on feeder cattle prices. What I found was, yes, higher sales volumes do lead to higher prices, but those higher prices are not a large marginal impact. So, for a 1,000 head increase at an auction sale, that's worth about $1 per hundredweight across the board. And so, I think it's important to realize that larger volumes do help prices, or at least support prices, but they're not going to lead to much larger and larger prices. But that's really important to show that, these auctions were essential to the supply chain and why they needed to stay open, and their ability to stay open really helped producers and were supportive of prices.
And speaking of auction action, something else you included in this write-up, a look at some shifting among the various markets and what kind of trends we saw in as far as feeder cattle sales based on some USDA information, you say.
So what I looked at is the National Feeder and Stocker Cattle Summary Report. That includes sales nationally. They do some breakdowns by states and regions as well. And what I was really interested in here is they report auctions, they report direct trades, and then e-markets, so video or online auction sales. And overall, we've seen auction sales dip 4%, or the number of head that went through those auctions nationally dip 4%. Auctions account for roughly 70% of the sales, but total receipts dipped 6.5%. So that said that, well, we've seen a bigger dip in direct sales and the e-market auctions. And where we've seen the biggest dip was in direct sales, kind of as you would expect, as we had these movement restrictions and lockdowns that really inhibited the ability to transact cattle. And that's where we've seen the big declines. Now, we also, I think seen some shifting then to these e-markets too. And especially in heavyweight sales. So as we've seen those delayed sales, if it was auctions or it was direct, well, some of that was picked up by these e-markets. So I think that suggests, just like anything, I've learned to use Zoom a lot better now than I had before. I think we've, as both producers and consumers at auctions, kind of have learned the value maybe of that flexibility. And not to say that, we're going to go all online, right? But I think maybe having that option of an online presence does provide for some flexibility. And going back to the earlier comment, that does potentially increase buyer competition, right? That I increase the amount of buyers just sheerly by offering that online auction. So I think, it's another maybe unintended consequence of COVID, in that we've really allowed our ability to enhance our ability to transact cattle and report those transactions. USDA's made some enhancements to be able to increase that.
Lastly, looking to the trading week ahead, better times coming?
Well, I would really look for markets to at least steady next week. I think we're still kind of feeling the effects of that rather bearish on the cattle market WASDE report. And so I'd hope we kind of settle out from that. We got the cattle on feed report this Friday of this week. And I think that potentially could be a friendly report showing lower placements again in December. And then the following Friday, on January 29th, we got the cattle inventory report. And so that'll kind of give us our next big benchmark of those cattle inventories, both nationally and by individual state.
Lee, always appreciate your input and the comments. Many thanks to you.
Thank you.
Out of Iowa State University, livestock economist Lee Schulz with us on this part of Agriculture Today.
What is radon? Home exposure to radon gas is the leading cause of lung cancer death in the United States for non-smokers. In Kansas, 1 in 4 homes will test at or above the EPA action level. The Surgeon General recommends all homes be tested and fixed if necessary. Visit kansasradonprogram.org for more information. Test, fix, save a life. This message brought to you by the Kansas Radon Program, the Kansas Association of Broadcasters, and this station.
Next up on Agriculture Today, a conversation between two of our K-State beef scientists about bull breeding genetics and the tools for assuring that bull power is serving its intended purpose in the cow-calf operation. This was the topic of the latest podcast hosted by K-State beef systems specialist Jaymelynn Farney. Jaymelynn welcoming in K-State beef geneticist Megan Rolf to talk about bull evaluation and selection.
Most of our selection and culling tools for male fertility has been associated with the breeding soundness exam, as well as expected progeny difference. So, Megan, I'm going to ask you, are breeding soundness exams and scrotal circumference still necessary components to bull selection, especially from a genetics perspective?
That's a great question. So, from a practical standpoint, the herd sire is going to really impact the fertility level and reproductive success of a herd more than any other individual or group of animals in that production system. Because if we have an open female, that's one female. If we have a bull that goes bad during the breeding season, or we turn a bull out that isn't good to begin with and doesn't breed any cows, that's a huge economic loss. So really we want to think about what tools are available to us in the industry to address that. And one of the things that we're focused on in our research group at K-State is what are the tools that we might be able to develop in the future to help address some of these issues maybe that we don't already have. And as you stated, 2 of the things that we do have available are breeding soundness examinations, and we have scrotal circumference EPDs on a lot of registered seed stock bulls. So BSEs are absolutely a critical management tool for producers, right? We don't want to turn out a bull that isn't going to breed cows, and the breeding soundness examination doesn't address every aspect of that, right? Because we can't necessarily measure an animal's libido as a part of that breeding soundness exam, but we can at least make sure in that BSE that they have no physical deformities that prevent them from breeding, and we can make sure that their semen quality is good enough to settle cows. So absolutely that BSE is a critical tool both before we buy a bull and something that we want to redo every time before we turn that bull out with a set of cows, right? Because if we have an entire set of open cows, that's a huge economic penalty. So a really, really big deal.
And in my mind, the BSEs are really a good tool for the immediate usage. But what about it from a genetic selection for fertility? Can your BSEs be associated with that?
Absolutely. BSEs are a critical management tool within the herd and something that every producer should be taking advantage of because it just helps avoid train wrecks, right? But we still do have the situation that bulls that don't pass breeding soundness examinations have always been around, right? Infertile bulls have always been around, and they sort of take themselves out of the population, and that's been happening since we've had cattle, but we still have bulls that have fertility issues, right? So if we want to try and make sure that we have fewer bulls that have fertility issues, one opportunity is to generate some of these genetic selection tools for specific male fertility or semen quality attributes and really select on those to try and lessen the number of bulls that we have that don't pass that BSE.
What about those bulls that maybe don't quite pass, say, the first time? Those that, motility ranges that are considered passes been reported anywhere between 30 to 80% motility. So maybe if your vet says, no, I'm not passing your bull right now, bring them back in 3 weeks and retest them. How would that be accounted for? You think that's something that could be accounted for genetically, or is that more of a nutritional-based issue?
That's a great question. So I'm going to try and tackle this a couple of different ways, and we may need to sort of juggle some things. But basically, there's 2 points that I want to make relative to that. And the first is that, there are absolutely nutritional and environmental effects on semen quality. So we know that heat stress and cold stress, as well as nutritional effects, can absolutely affect semen quality at a specific point in time. So that's something that we can adjust for when we know what plane of nutrition animals have been on, or we know the environmental conditions. We can kind of account for that in genetic analyses. And one way that we can do that is through contemporary grouping or through fitting specific effects that we know impact semen quality. So that's one way to sort of get at that. I think one other piece of your question is sort of related to maybe the maturity of those bulls. Often, you may take a yearling bull in and he may not pass a BSE, may have a lot of proximal droplets is one example of an issue that can be seen with younger bulls. And it may be that you bring him back 60 days later and he'll pass the BSE and then we can go on to sell him. Of course, that's an issue if you have an earlier production sale and you're trying to sell yearling bulls and they don't pass the BSE, you can't get them in the sale. That's potentially an economic hit. But I think it merits some thought related to whether we want to continue using bulls that maybe can't pass that BSE earlier. Maybe we're just selecting for later maturing bulls. Maybe we're sort of letting ourselves use bulls with subpar fertility because we can bring them back later and they'll actually pass with fewer abnormalities. But maybe we do ourselves a disservice when we do that. And I don't know the answer to that. So I'm kind of posing a question back, I suppose. But I think those are some things that merit some thought.
And logically, that kind of makes sense. I mean, you would potentially think, and, granted, I don't know, and it doesn't sound like maybe if there is a cause and effect that, if they can pass the BSE at an earlier age, do we increase age of puberty, for example, or stuff like that? I do not know if that's out there.
Yeah, I don't know a specific answer to that. One thing I do know is that there are a few studies that have looked at like genetic correlations between male fertility and female fertility, and they appear to be pretty low. So I think that tells us two things. One is that, we've done some work in the beef industry, really good work to develop female fertility selection tools, and lots of breed associations have developed things like heifer pregnancy EPDs and things of that nature to really get at the female side of the equation, which is awesome. Those are really, really important tools within the industry. But if the genetic correlation is low, what that tells us is that we're probably not making any progress or not much progress in male fertility when we select for female fertility. So that probably makes a little bit of an argument for having some separate male fertility focused selection tools so that we can kind of tackle some of that.
It really makes sense to me for most of your indexes that have multi-traits in it. It seems to have more beneficial decision capabilities for producers. And I think that you're right on track with having some of these multi-trait or trying to account for multi-factors in a selection index. The greatest genetic change to your operation does occur through your bulls. So you want to make sure you have very fertile bulls.
Absolutely. If you're keeping replacement heifers out of your bulls, in a couple of generations, the genetics of your bulls is going to make up more than 80% of your cow herd. So the investments that you make in a natural herd sire or the bulls that you choose to AI your cows with really can make a dramatic difference in the overall genetic level of any number of traits in the herd.
Yes, and for those of you listening in podcast land, you don't get to read the article that I've been reading that Megan had wrote, but she has several interesting things that made me stop and think. If there was some genetic way via EPD or some other genomic type of component where you could identify at weaning those bulls that are infertile and get rid of them then instead of feeding them and then having them fail the BSE.
Yeah, that's a great point. So if we take a bull all the way to yearling or past and he can't pass a BSE, we've put a tremendous amount of development costs into that animal. And you can always go back and sell the animal, but if we have an animal that's developed some of those secondary sex characteristics, you're going to take a discount for that animal. So in my mind, it's very comparable to and potentially even worse than if you raise a replacement heifer that doesn't get bred, right? You can sell that replacement heifer for salvage value to be fed out, similar to we can to the bulls, but those bulls will have those secondary sex characteristics, and you're going to get kind of an additional discount on top of the economic insult of sort of raising that animal for that length of time. And that's a really substantial investment for producers. And so I think anything that we can do to try and select for animals that will pass that BSE and be able to be sold and marketed on schedule will be of benefit not only to the seed stock producers selling the bulls, but also to the commercial cattlemen that are buying them that will have a really fertile bull to be able to go out and settle cows.
That's K-State beef geneticist Megan Rolf, who was featured on the latest podcast from K-State's Jaymelynn Farney. That podcast series is called Dr. J's Beef, and we'd encourage you to give it a listen in full. Just go online and search for Dr. J's Beef. This is Agriculture Today.
Did you know every Kansas farmer feeds 128-plus people?
Kansas farmers are hard workers, dependable, authentic, and sensitive.
Not only do farmers put food on your table, but they put clothes on your back and fuel in your car.
For more information about Kansas farmers, visit K-State Research and Extension online or stop by your local extension office. This message has been brought to you by the K-State Animal Sciences Leadership Academy participants.
Agriculture Today continues now. Eric Atkinson with you. Every month, the Kansas Forest Service, here here at K-State, posts an informational podcast, most often on management of our tree resources in Kansas, as you'd imagine. The podcast guest this month, someone you've heard from frequently here on this broadcast for many years, K-State forester Charlie Barden. Charlie sat down with KFS Communications Coordinator Cassie Wandersee to discuss the importance of managing and preserving trees in this state, if nothing else because of their scarcity compared to the woodlands that Charlie grew up in the far northeastern part of our country. He puts it this way.
Right. Well, the thing is, the state only has, 5% woodlands acreage or 7% of woodland cover if you count trees in cities and like that. But it's that 5 to 7%, which is really important. Other states, back in part of where I grew up in Maine, they're 90% forested. So if they lost 1% of their forests, it wouldn't be a big deal. But here in Kansas, with 5% forested, if we lose 1% forest, that's 1 out of 5 trees. That's 20% of our woodland cover. We have a big impact. And so I found that where we have fewer trees, they need to be valued a little bit more highly. The few trees we have in a thin strip growing along a creek or stream edge really helps hold that stream bank in place during a flood. As floodwaters get up and expand, those few trees along the edge of the bank help stop the log jams and flotsam and jetsam that's coming down the floodwaters. It gets held within the riparian areas, so spreading out over the road or over the farmers' fields. The roots help hold the soil during erosion. The trees on small creeks and streams are shading the water and keeping it cooler, which makes it a healthier, better environment for fish and other aquatic life. So there might be just a thin row of trees along that stream, but they're doing lots of different functions out there in the landscape. My elevator speech, I always say I try to use trees to solve environmental problems. When people say, what do you do in Kansas with trees? Well, I use trees to solve environmental problems, whether it's for a windbreak or a riparian area or just what it is that needs to be done.
So what are some steps that people can take to help, keep their woodlands healthy or to really think about improving the timber stand that they do have?
One of the biggest threats we have right now in the eastern part of the state is bush honeysuckle. It's an invasive understory shrub that looks pretty. It keeps its bright green leaves come out early in late March, and they stay green until mid-November, and they have these red berries. People wonder, what's that pretty little bush growing in the understory? Well, it's this bush honeysuckle, which can be very invasive, and it can make a dense understory underneath the native trees and choke out the regeneration and the seedlings of the next generation of trees you like coming. So that's probably one of the biggest threats, is check to see if you have bush honeysuckle in your Kansas woodland. You may want to survey it, and if they do some control of it.
And what might some of those control options be?
Usually the only way to be effective with it is herbicide, carefully applying chemical. There's several different methods you can use. You can spray Roundup in late fall when the honeysuckle still has green leaves and the other native trees do not. And so the Roundup just goes in through the green tissue and kills or greatly weakens the bush honeysuckle. One of the techniques I've used on my own property is to use a mix of diesel fuel and herbicide to spray the bases of the stems any time of year, really, but fall and winter is a good time to do it, where you just apply herbicide in the diesel oil, and the oil penetrates the bark and carries the chemical in with it and kills back the shrub that way.
So are there other examples of invasive or damaging plants, but like woody shrubs or trees that are having the same effect as Asian bush honeysuckle?
Right. That's probably the worst one in the woodlands. We see some Sericea lespedesia coming into new plantings or new riparian or field plantings. We'll take advantage of that area. But in the woodlands, I think that's really the worst one. And,
how, as we're having this conversation, how do people balance the selection of those plant materials? It's something that, even here with the Kansas Forest Service, we're looking at different species now of trees that might not be native in this area that will deal better with some of these changing conditions that we have in climate. So what are kind of your thoughts there on that native versus non-native species selection?
Yeah, I don't discriminate that hard against the non-natives as some folks do. We've lost most of our big elms through Dutch elm disease. We're losing our ash in eastern Kansas with emerald ash borer. And so if we have a replacement species for some of those that wasn't born here in the U.S., I'm fine with that. We just need to be careful they aren't going to be really invasive species like Sericea or the bush honeysuckle.
having an understanding of what those forest types are could really help you with some of those management decisions or looking at your planning there for plantings and whatnot.
Right, looking at what kind of trees grow well in that area. And we've done a number of different woodland surveys and riparian surveys, and even if hackberry wasn't the major species in the overstory, it tends to dominate the regeneration because it grows well in the shade of other trees. So in addition to controlling the bush honeysuckle, sometimes we need to really work hard to get back our oak and hickory and our more valuable species back, and our walnuts. If we just cut those large oaks and walnuts with enough, but hackberry will come up underneath them. And hackberry, it's a nice tree, but it doesn't have much timber value, and it doesn't produce a big seed and nut crop for wildlife to fatten up for the winter. So it's kind of has some limitations.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, see, Charlie, I'm the opposite. I think hackberry is an absolute junk tree. They are surrounding my house. They're all along our creek. I could spend weeks with a chainsaw cutting them, and I don't think I would get through even just a little bit of what's there.
Well, I didn't want to be too harsh with them, but they just don't have the value that some other species do. But if we don't do anything, that's the trend line that the woodlands are going to, is dominated by hackberry. What we see mostly hackberry and elm in the understory is seedlings and saplings, and the elms start to drop out with Dutch elm disease, and the hackberry just keeps growing and getting bigger and shading out and everything else.
And what's kind of your thought or your train of thinking, or maybe the theory behind the human intervention there? Is that should we be intervening in those forests by going in and maybe thinning hackberries or doing that timber stand improvement?
It depends on the landowner, but I think we should. We don't need to do that on every acre and every land ownership. But if the homeowner, the landowner, is interested in oaks and walnuts and hickories, they're interested in wildlife and feeding those wildlife, they'll want to try to perpetuate that oak hickory forest type in the future. And if they don't do anything, they need to realize that those oaks will eventually get old and fall over and lose vigor and be replaced by hackberry, which doesn't have the same values. So it depends on the landowner. If they're interested in maintaining those values, they need to do some management.
K-State Forester Charlie Barden talking with Cassie Wandersee of the Kansas Forest Service. To hear the entire podcast or for a wealth of information on tree establishment and management, go to kansasforests.org. That's kansasforests.org. And we'll be back shortly on Agriculture Today.
Did you eat today? Thank a farmer. A way to get more involved in agriculture is through 4-H and FFA. Through 4-H and FFA, we have been given multiple opportunities to grow as leaders and learn more about agriculture.
You can learn skills related to jobs, public speaking skills, and you get the opportunity to travel around the country and meet new people.
If you want more information about getting more involved in 4-H and FFA, visit them on their websites at kansasffa.org and kansas4h.org.
Welcome back, and thanks for joining us on Agriculture Today. I'm Jeff Wickman. Kansas youth interested in learning about the legislative process with an emphasis on deliberation and finding common ground are encouraged to participate in this year's Citizenship in Action. Kansas 4-H Extension Communications Specialist Aliah Mestrovich Seay and Southeast Area Kansas 4-H Youth Development Specialist Beth Hinshaw have a preview of this year's virtual event. Beth, Citizenship in Action is Sunday, February 14th and Monday, February 15th. Give us the specifics in terms of who should be interested in this and exactly what they'll be doing.
Citizenship in Action is for young people who are ages 13 to 18 as of January 1 of this year. They do not need to be a member of a 4-H club. Any young person is welcome to attend. The way that we are going about this year, as you are not surprised, is this will be a virtual event. And the offerings are on Sunday the 14th from 1 to 5:30, and then on Monday, February the 15th from 1 to 4:30.
So obviously it's going to be important to have computer access.
Yes, most definitely. Whoever registers is going to need a consistent internet connection. And our suggestion is that they have a device like a computer or a tablet so that they can see and take part in the program in the best way.
There will be some group deliberations going on. That's really kind of the focus of this, right, Aliah?
That's exactly right. So last year, we shifted from a debate kind of win or lose centered model to one of dialogue and deliberation, where we actually support different truths and claims and really take into consideration everybody's point of view as we're talking about societal issues that matter, deliberate on it, actually, agree to disagree and find a way to come to a consensus for the common good. We're going to be continuing to use that deliberation and dialogic model this year for our community conversations that are taking place within Citizenship in Action.
And you're looking at a house divided and some policing issues.
Yes. So Youth Council actually got together and they were given a list of different national issues forums that are very current, and they were able to vote and decided that they wanted to talk more about, what would we as a society have to give up to get the political system that we truly want that would benefit all of us. And remember, this is always on a spectrum. There are different options available, and they deliberate and weigh out those options. And then the second one is policing. What should we do to ensure equal justice and fair treatment in our communities?
So how will this work then as you do this virtually? Will you have a chance to break out into rooms, or is this just one giant conversation?
Oh, that's a great question. So we actually use a platform through National Issues Forums that will allow us to get into small groups and see how we are deliberating. We'll actually be able to use a platform that will give us information and data about how participants' ideas have shifted and changed throughout the deliberation. And it even helps us find the common good. So we're going to be using a combination of Zoom and this online platform to have these community conversations for the first time for CIA.
And are these youth then that are leading these conversations? Because I know several have trained in this area.
Yes, we will have youth once again exercising their leadership, facilitating these conversations, and maintaining neutrality as they facilitate.
There is also a need for chaperones, just like if this were a in-person event. As I understand it, you're also looking for some virtual chaperones?
Yes, just like all of our events, we need adult supervision. And so that will be probably some volunteers from across the state and some extension staff.
And you're also trying to line up some legislators who might also be able to Zoom in and talk to the youth?
Yes, our program, in addition to the deliberation on the first day, on that second day, we will have several speakers that are a legislator for sure. And we're also looking at how a number of our 4-H alumni are making a difference in their own community. And that's part of our charge as we leave on Monday, is having everybody think about how they can do that.
I know this is an event that is always widely attended. In terms of the virtual aspect, how many can you hold? Will you have to limit it all, or is this pretty much wide open, maybe even a bigger audience than normal?
The online platform will allow for as many participants as we have. So we are hoping that we will have a good amount of youth that are ready to go and ready to deliberate.
I guess the one thing I would say is that we are excited that we can continue with Citizenship in Action this year, even though we can't be in Topeka. We are thankful that we do have a virtual option to give this opportunity to young people.
Would they normally have been able then to observe some of the legislature in action?
Yes, in a normal year, they could have attended committee meetings and sat in the gallery and watched the Senate or the House. And certainly one of the highlights in the past had always been taking the tour of the Capitol and doing the Dome tour.
And kind of in light of that, you're encouraging them to see what's going on at the local level and talk to some of their local elected officials.
Yes, we know that leadership happens at all levels, and we think this is a good opportunity to focus on that.
The registration process, what do they need to do in order to take part in this?
We have an online registration, and if they go to the Kansas 4-H webpage, that's kansas4h.org, and over on the left, they'll see a Register for Events button, and when they click that, they will see Citizenship in Action as an option. We do need people to be registered by February the 1st, and there is a $35 registration fee. And one of the things that'll be different this year, because we are remote, is we will actually be putting together a Citizenship in Action t-shirt, and that they will get that mailed to their extension office after the event.
And that's all part of their registration fee?
Yes, that is all a part of it. In addition to, they'll also get some information mailed to them about these different issues and just materials so that they can participate fully in the event.
That's Southeast Area Kansas 4-H Youth Development Specialist Beth Hinshaw and Kansas 4-H Extension Communications Specialist Aliah Mestrovich Seay with an overview of this year's Citizenship in Action, being held virtually February 14th and 15th. For more information or to register, visit kansas4h.org. And that'll do it for this edition of Agriculture Today. For Eric Atkinson, I'm Jeff Wickman. This is the K-State Radio Network.